tide sighed against the shore, its retreat whispering over the sand like a secret never meant to be spoken aloud. Thomas crouched at the water's edge, the toes of his battered sneakers sinking slightly with each wave. His hands sifted through a small mound of pebbles and shells, picking out the ones that seemed interesting enough to bring back home. He wasn't sure why he did this. His shelves were already cluttered with jars of rocks, feathers, and other oddities from places he'd wandered. Maybe it was a way to prove to himself that he'd been somewhere, that he'd existed beyond the humdrum of his narrow apartment. It was then that he spotted it. Nestled just above the waterline, half buried in wet sand, was an object that didn't belong, a jar. The glass was old, its surface uneven and slightly fogged, as though it had spent decades rolling in the ocean's belly. A rusted metal lid sealed it shut, and inside, the contents gleamed faintly in the muted sunlight. Sand, but not like the ordinary golden grains beneath his feet. This was finer, almost powdery, and shimmered faintly as though lit from within. He plucked the jar from the sand, shaking off clumps of wet grit that clung to the glass. For a moment he thought about leaving it behind. There was something about it that made his stomach churn faintly, a feeling he quickly dismissed as the after effect of skipping breakfast. "Looks old," he muttered to himself, turning it over in his hands. The glass caught the light and refracted it in odd patterns, casting a brief, fleeting shadow that didn't quite match the jar's shape. He shoved it into his backpack and began the long trudge back to his car, eager to escape the growing chill that came as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Back at his apartment, Thomas set the jar on the kitchen counter. The lid resisted at first when he tried to twist it, the metal groaning under his grip, but eventually it gave way with a satisfying pop. A faint, briny smell wafted out, like sea air trapped in a bottle for centuries. He wrinkled his nose and quickly resealed it, deciding to place it on the bookshelf in his living room instead of with the rest of his collection. The jar looked oddly at home there, nestled among stacks of neglected books and other curiosities. He admired it for a moment before turning to make dinner, a simple grilled cheese. Thomas had a habit of cooking mechanically, his mind wandering as he flipped bread and cheese on the stovetop. Tonight, though, his thoughts kept drifting back to the jar. Something about it nagged at him, like the faint itch of a mosquito bite he couldn't quite locate. When he sat down to eat, the feeling intensified. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw something move near the bookshelf, a subtle, almost imperceptible shifting. He glanced over, expecting to see a cockroach or perhaps a draft, dislodging a loose page. But the jar sat undisturbed, the faint shimmer of its contents now subdued in the dim light. He shook his head. "Get a grip, man." That night, Thomas dreamed of the ocean. He was standing on the same beach where he'd found the jar, but the tide was wrong, unnatural. The waves didn't crash but seemed to inhale, pulling the sand toward the horizon in long, sinuous ribbons. The sound was overwhelming, a deep rhythmic pulse that rattled in his chest and seemed to whisper words just beyond the edge of comprehension. He woke abruptly, his sheets damp with sweat, and immediately felt the grit beneath his fingertips. Sand. It was scattered across his bed, fine and powdery, glinting faintly in the faint moonlight that spilled through his blinds. Heart pounding, he leapt out of bed and flicked on the light. There was more sand, on the floor, in the folds of his blanket, even dusting his nightstand like a fine coating of ash. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. Had he tracked it in from the beach? That didn't make sense. He'd vacuumed his car thoroughly and hadn't noticed any sand on his shoes or clothes. He went to the living room, his bare feet crunching faintly over the grains that had somehow spread into the hallway. The jar was still there, sitting on the shelf. For a moment, Thomas swore it looked fuller than before, though he couldn't be certain. He approached it cautiously, his breath shallow, and picked it up. The lid was firmly sealed, yet a faint dusting of sand coated the surface beneath it. The next morning, Thomas found his favorite mug had changed. It sat on the counter where he'd left it the night before, but the ceramic felt wrong. It was dry and brittle, with an unnatural texture like crushed sandstone. When he lifted it, the handle crumbled in his fingers, leaving a pile of fine sand on the countertop. The same uneasy itch crawled up his spine as it had when he first saw the jar. He grabbed a garbage bag, threw the jar inside without a second thought, and stormed out to the dumpster behind his building. It landed with a hollow thud, its faint shimmer barely visible through the layers of black plastic. Relieved, he returned to his apartment. But when he walked back into the living room, the jar was there again, perched on the shelf as though it had never left. The shimmering sand inside seemed to glow faintly, as though it were mocking him. Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he stared at the jar. The plastic bag he'd used to throw it away was gone, no sign of it in the room, no scraps of black material on the floor. The jar sat as pristine as ever, its glass faintly reflecting the overhead light. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing deep breaths through his nose. "Stress, you're tired. It's a trick of the mind." When he opened his eyes, the jar hadn't moved. The sand inside seemed heavier, as if the jar's contents had shifted slightly in his absence. The faint shimmer he'd noticed before was brighter now, glinting with an almost hypnotic rhythm. He couldn't tear his gaze away, his thoughts swirling. How had it returned? Was this some elaborate prank? He stepped forward and reached for it, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold, uneven glass. A sharp jolt ran up his arm as he lifted the jar, and his grip nearly faltered. For a split second, he thought he'd seen movement within the sand. It wasn't just shimmering anymore. It was swirling, shifting, like it was alive. "No," he whispered, setting the jar down on the coffee table. His hand lingered on the lid, and he fought the urge to open it, to look closer. Instead, he backed away and grabbed his phone, intending to call someone, anyone. But as he swiped the screen, sand spilled from the speaker grill, coating the surface with fine, glimmering grains. His stomach flipped. He dropped the phone as if it had burned him, the sand pooling on the floor like it was bleeding from the device. "What is happening?" The faint whispers returned, brushing against the edges of his hearing like a breeze through cracked windows. At first they were indistinct, a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as he stood there, paralyzed, they began to take shape, words barely audible, yet unmistakably his name. "Thomas!" He spun around, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. There was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled his ears, drowning out the rational voice in his mind. "Thomas, return." He covered his ears, stumbling backward, his heel crunching into something soft. When he looked down, he realized he was standing in another pile of sand, one that hadn't been there moments ago. It was spreading now, spilling out from beneath the couch, seeping from the edges of the walls, like a tide rising against the shores of his reality. Frantic, he grabbed the jar again and hurled it at the wall with all his strength. The glass shattered, shards exploding outward in a brilliant, shimmering spray. The sand poured out, cascading onto the floor in a thick, swirling mass. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the sand began to move. It writhed and coiled like a living thing, gathering itself into strange, twisting shapes. Thomas stumbled back, his chest tightening with terror. The whispers rose again, louder and more distinct, as the sand twisted into vague, human-like forms. Faces emerged briefly in the swirling chaos, their hollow eyes and open mouths filled with an unspoken anguish. One figure stepped forward, its skin a shifting tapestry of grains that glimmered faintly in the dim light. It extended an arm, its fingers dissolving into a fine spray as it gestured toward him. "Return," the figure rasped, its voice layered with the whispers of 1,000 others. "You were never meant to leave." Thomas's legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the floor, his hands scrabbling at the sand that now covered almost every surface. The world around him seemed to dissolve, the walls and furniture fading into an infinite expanse of dunes. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, sharp and suffocating. "No!" he screamed, clawing at the floor as the sand began to creep up his legs, cold and weightless, yet impossibly strong. It wrapped around him like a lover's embrace, pulling him down, grain by grain. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him was the faint shimmer of the jar's shards, lying untouched amid the endless, shifting sands. The world came back to Thomas in fragments, as if he were piecing together a dream after waking. His face was pressed against something coarse and dry. When he opened his eyes, he saw sand, not the beige sand of the beach, but the silvery, shimmering grains from the jar. It stretched in every direction, the apartment swallowed whole. The walls, the furniture, even the faint hum of the refrigerator were gone, replaced by an eerie, endless expanse of dunes. Thomas scrambled to his feet, shaking off the grains clinging to his skin. His breaths came sharp and shallow as he turned in circles, his shoes sinking slightly into the ever-shifting surface. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though it had weight. Far off in the distance, a faint rhythmic pulse echoed, whoosh, whoosh, like waves, but no water was in sight. He spun around, hoping, praying, to see something familiar. The bookshelf, his kitchen, even the shattered remnants of the jar. But there was nothing. Just the endless sand and, faintly, the silhouettes of figures on the horizon. "Help," he called out, his voice cracking. The figures didn't respond. They moved slowly, their forms barely visible through the shimmering haze. The whispers returned. This time they were everywhere, a cacophony of voices speaking over one another, yet somehow unified. Thomas clutched his head, squeezing his temples to block out the noise, but it didn't help. "You can't escape. You took what wasn't yours. Return." His stomach twisted as he realized the voices weren't just speaking to him. They were speaking through him. Each whisper felt like it came from deep within his own chest, a vibration in his bones that made his skin crawl. "No," he shouted, his voice raw. "You're not real. This isn't real." But as he turned to run, he stumbled. Looking down, he gasped. His left shoe was gone, replaced by a perfectly sculpted replica made of sand. He pulled his foot free and watched in horror as the grains scattered, sinking back into the ground and disappearing into the endless expanse. His hands began to tremble. He yanked off the other shoe, then his socks, but the sand clung to his skin, grinding against him with every movement. He could feel it beneath his fingernails, in the cracks of his lips, in the corners of his eyes. The figures on the horizon were closer now. They moved like marionettes, their limbs jerking unnaturally, their forms flickering and dissolving before reforming again. Thomas backed away, his legs sinking deeper into the sand with every step. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice barely louder than the whispers. One of the figures raised an arm, pointing at him. Its face was a shifting mass of sand grains, hollow where its eyes should have been. "You took us with you," it rasped. The voice was wrong, layered, as though it were many voices speaking in unison. "Now you must join us." Hours blurred into days, or at least it felt that way. Thomas no longer knew how long he'd been wandering through the endless expanse. His phone was gone, swallowed by the sand. The figures followed him relentlessly, always distant but never far enough to give him peace. Each step became harder than the last. His legs were weak, trembling under his weight. The sand clung to his body, heavier now, coating his calves like wet concrete. His left hand, his dominant hand, was no longer flesh, but a brittle, crumbling sculpture. Every movement caused grains to fall away, scattering into the wind. When he tried to scream, his voice came out dry and raspy, as though the sand had filled his throat. He dropped to his knees, clawing at his chest, desperate to feel something other than the coarse grains grinding against his skin. The hallucinations began shortly after. He saw his apartment, vivid and alive, standing in the middle of the dunes like a mirage. Inside, everything was normal. The jar was back on the bookshelf, its contents shimmering innocently. He heard the faint sound of a radio, the clatter of dishes in the sink, and the hum of his refrigerator. "Just a dream," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with relief. But when he stepped forward, the apartment dissolved into sand, the illusion crumbling before his eyes. By the time the figures reached him, Thomas no longer had the strength to run. His legs were gone below the knees, replaced entirely by sand. He collapsed, his body folding awkwardly into the dunes. The figures surrounded him, their hollow eyes watching as he crumbled further. One by one, they reached out, their grainy hands resting on his shoulders, his arms, his head. Thomas couldn't move, he couldn't scream, he could only watch as his fingers dissolved, the grains floating up to join the ever-shifting forms of the figures. "You belong here," the voices said, the whispers now a deafening roar. "You always have." Thomas closed his eyes, his remaining flesh crumbling away, until he was nothing more than another shifting silhouette in the dunes. The sand was still for a moment, the whispers fading into silence. Then, far away, on the edge of the horizon, the faint shimmer of a glass jar appeared, waiting for the next traveler to take it home. The world Thomas knew no longer existed. The endless dunes were his reality now, a vast, shimmering wasteland of silvery sand that swallowed every trace of who he had been. He stood among the figures, his form indistinct and ever-shifting. His consciousness remained, but his body was no longer his own. He could feel the grains of sand that made him, each vibrating with the faint resonance of voices, countless others who had fallen victim to the jar. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the tide of whispers that filled the air. The figures around him moved with a languid rhythm, their bodies dissolving and reforming with every step. They were not separate entities, but fragments of something larger, pieces of a collective consciousness bound by the sand. I'm still here, Thomas thought, clinging to the faint spark of his humanity. But even as he thought it, the sand responded, pulling at his mind, drowning it in a cacophony of voices. Somewhere in the vast expanse, Thomas saw a figure that stood apart from the others. It was larger, more defined, its form almost human. Unlike the others, it didn't shift or dissolve. Instead, it remained solid, its surface gleaming like polished glass. It stood motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on Thomas. The whispers grew louder as the figure approached, its presence radiating an unbearable pressure. Thomas felt the sand within him tremble, as though responding to an unspoken command. "You have taken," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the dunes like a crashing wave. "And now you must give." "I didn't mean to," Thomas shouted, though his voice was dry and raspy, barely audible above the whispers. "I didn't know." The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "Ignorance does not absolve you. You brought us beyond our shores. Now you are one of us." The sand beneath Thomas began to shift, pulling him downward. He struggled, clawing at the grains, but his hands passed through them as though they were water. "Please," he begged, "let me go. I'll bring the jar back. I'll return it." The figure loomed closer, its hollow eyes glowing faintly with a cold, silvery light. "It cannot be returned. The jar is a tether, a gateway. It will find another, as it always has. You are part of the tide now." Thomas felt himself sinking faster, the sand rising to his chest. The figures around him moved closer, their forms merging with his, their whispers becoming his own. Memories flashed through his mind, fragments of his life before the jar, his cluttered apartment, the dusty bookshelves, the lonely dinners eaten in silence. But the memories were fleeting, slipping away like grains through his fingers. In their place, new memories surfaced, memories that weren't his. He saw the beach as it had been long ago, untouched by time. He felt the pull of the tide, the endless cycle of the jar passing from one hand to the next. He saw the faces of those who had come before him, each of them swallowed by the sand, their identities eroded until they were nothing but voices in the tide. And then he saw the jar again, gleaming on the horizon, waiting for its next victim. The transformation was complete. Thomas no longer existed as a single being. He was part of the sand, his consciousness dispersed among the countless grains that made up the endless dunes. But the jar remained, a beacon for the unwary. On a distant beach, far from the dunes, a traveler stumbled upon it, half buried in the wet sand. The glass shimmered faintly, the sand inside glinting like starlight. The traveler hesitated, their hand hovering over the jar. And then curiosity won. As the jar was lifted from the sand, the tide stirred, and the whispers began again.